The battle America forgot the Vietnam War had been raging for years. By 1969, American soldiers had been fighting for 4 long years, facing harsh jungles, brutal enemies, and a war that seemed to have no end. Back home, the American public was growing tired of the conflict. The horrifying images of young men dying in the jungles of Vietnam flooded newspapers and television screens. People were angry. Protests spread across the country. One battle in particular shocked the nation, the Battle of Hamburger Hill. It was a bloody fight over a hill that had no real strategic value. 72 American soldiers died, and many more were wounded. The battle became a symbol of the war's brutality and senselessness. But what if I told you that, at the very same time, another battle was taking place just 100 miles south of Hamburger Hill? A battle just as brutal, if not worse. A battle that lasted 4 long weeks. A battle where American soldiers were pushed to their absolute limits, facing an enemy that seemed to never run out of men, bullets, or bombs. Unlike Hamburger Hill, this battle was kept a secret. The government didn't want more outrage from the American people. The soldiers who fought there were left forgotten, their sacrifices unknown to the world. This is the story of the Battle of Tam Kỳ, one of the most brutal and overlooked battles of the Vietnam War. Before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more forgotten stories like this to life. Now let's dive into the battle that history tried to erase. By 1969, the Vietnam War was at a turning point. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, had become stronger, more organized, and more determined than ever. The Americans were struggling to win, and back home, public support for the war was collapsing. One of the most dangerous areas in Vietnam was Quảng Tín Province, located just 40 miles south of Da Nang. This region was crucial because it connected North and South Vietnam. Whoever controlled this province could control the movement of troops and supplies. The U.S. Hamburger Division responsible for defending this area was already stretched thin. But in early May 1969, something even worse happened. The NVA secretly moved 2 full regiments into the province. These were battle-hardened troops, highly trained and ready to fight. The Hamburger Division had no idea what was coming. On May 12, 1969, the NVA launched a massive surprise attack. Within just 2 days, they took control of 80% of the province. American bases, fire support zones, and landing zones were under siege. The Hamburger Division was caught completely off guard. The attacks were fierce, and the Americans struggled to hold their ground. One of the hardest-hit areas was Landing Zone Professional, a critical fire support base. It was defended by the 1st Battalion, 46th Infantry Regiment, but they were badly outnumbered and struggling to survive against relentless enemy attacks. Realizing that the Hamburger Division could not hold the province alone, the U.S. military called for reinforcements. The Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, MACV, saw the importance of the battle and reacted quickly. They ordered 2 battalions from the legendary 101st Airborne Division to be deployed to Quảng Tín Province. The operation was codenamed Operation Lamar Plain, and it would send the 101st Airborne into one of the toughest fights of the entire Vietnam War. But the men of the 101st Airborne Division had no idea what they were walking into. They were about to face some of the most intense jungle warfare of the entire conflict, one that history would later forget. The battle begins May 12 to 14, 1969. On May 12, 1969, the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, launched a powerful surprise attack in Quảng Tín Province. They struck with overwhelming force, targeting key American bases, fire support locations, and landing zones. The attack was fast, brutal, and well-planned. Within just 2 days, the NVA had taken control of 80% of the province. American forces, caught completely off guard, struggled to fight back. The Hamburger Division, responsible for defending the area, was quickly losing ground. The situation was becoming desperate. One of the hardest-hit locations was Landing Zone, LZ Professional, a critical fire support base defended by the 1st Battalion, 46th Infantry Regiment. The NVA focused heavy attacks on this base, knowing that if they took it, they could completely cut off American forces in the region. The U.S. soldiers at LZ Professional were trapped, running low on ammunition and facing constant mortar and machine gun fire. Realizing they were on the verge of losing the province, American commanders knew they needed help, fast. The Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, MACV, immediately called for reinforcements. Their answer? The 101st Airborne Division, one of the most elite and battle-hardened units in Vietnam. On May 14, 1969, two battalions from the 101st Airborne were ordered to deploy to Quảng Tín Province under Operation Lamar Plain. Their mission was clear: stop the NVA, rescue their fellow soldiers, and take back control of the province. The units chosen for this dangerous task were 1st Battalion, 501st Infantry Regiment, 1st Battalion, 502nd Infantry Regiment. Additionally, the 1st Battalion, 46th Infantry Regiment, already fighting in the area, would be attached to the task force. The men of the 101st Airborne Division were tough and experienced, having already fought in some of the war's most intense battles. But when they landed in Quảng Tín Province, they had no idea that they were walking into one of the deadliest battles of their entire deployment. They were about to face weeks of relentless combat, brutal heat, and an enemy that refused to back down. The Battle of Tam Kỳ had begun. 4. Arrival of the 101st Airborne Division, May 15, 1969. The 101st Airborne Division was one of the most skilled and battle-hardened units in the U.S. Army. By 1969, they had already proven themselves in some of the toughest battles of the Vietnam War, but nothing could have prepared them for what awaited them in Quảng Tín Province. On May 15, 1969, the first wave of 101st Airborne soldiers arrived in the province. They landed in large CH-47 Chinook helicopters, carrying only the most essential supplies: ammunition, weapons, and a few rations. Due to the urgency of the situation, their heavier gear, food, and vehicles were scheduled to arrive later by truck and jeep. There was no time to rest. The moment their boots touched the ground, the paratroopers were thrown into combat. Their first task was reconnaissance in force, moving through the jungle to locate enemy positions and attack them head-on. The 1st Battalion of the 501st Infantry Regiment was assigned to patrol near Landing Zone Professional, where the heaviest fighting was taking place. They were ordered to push forward, clear enemy bunkers, and rescue trapped soldiers from the American Division. The men quickly realized that this was not like their previous battles. The terrain was harsh, hot, and unforgiving. The thick jungle, high humidity, and scorching sun made every movement exhausting. The soldiers were already suffering from dehydration and fatigue, but they had no choice but to keep moving. Adding to the danger was the unpredictability of the enemy. The NVA had spent years building an elaborate system of bunkers, tunnels, and hidden spider holes throughout the region. These underground networks allowed them to move unseen, ambush American patrols, and disappear before airstrikes could hit them. Over the next few days, the 101st Airborne pushed deeper into enemy territory. They encountered abandoned NVA huts, hidden weapons caches, and the occasional sniper fire. But the main force of the enemy was still nowhere to be found. But the soldiers knew one thing: the enemy was out there, waiting, and soon enough they would make their presence known in the most brutal way possible. The Battle for Hill 187, May 21, 1969. For days, the 101st Airborne Division had been patrolling the dense jungles of Quảng Tín Province, searching for the enemy. The heat was unbearable. Supplies were running low, and the soldiers were exhausted. But on May 21, 1969, they finally found what they were looking for, or rather, the enemy found them. Intelligence reports warned of a large enemy presence near Hill 187, a heavily forested ridge that overlooked key American positions. 3 companies from the 1st Battalion, 501st Infantry Regiment, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta companies, were sent to investigate. They were accompanied by a recon platoon, whose job was to scout ahead and locate the enemy. As they moved toward Hill 187, the recon platoon and Bravo company suddenly came under heavy fire. The NVA had dug in and were waiting for them. Enemy soldiers fired from hidden bunkers, spider holes, and tree lines using AK-47s, mortars, and a powerful 12.7mm machine gun that pinned the Americans down. The Americans were in an open area with little cover, making them easy targets. For 30 minutes they were unable to move, trapped by relentless enemy fire. Every time a soldier tried to lift his head, bullets whizzed past. Mortar rounds exploded all around them. The situation was critical. Charlie and Delta companies arrived just in time, forcing the NVA to withdraw temporarily. But this was only the beginning. Now that they knew where the enemy was hiding, the battalion received a new order. Take the hill. Advancing up Hill 187 would be a nightmare. The NVA had fortified their bunkers using stone walls, giving them a major advantage. Every American advance was met with machine gun fire, grenades, and mortar shells. Worse still, the enemy used underground tunnels to move between bunkers, reinforcing positions even after they had been cleared. American soldiers would take out one bunker, only to be ambushed from behind by enemy soldiers emerging from hidden tunnels. The battle turned into a brutal, close-quarters fight. Soldiers had to rely on grenades, suppressive fire, and bayonets to clear out enemy positions. The 101st Airborne was determined to push forward, but casualties were mounting, and the battle was far from over. 6. The heroism of Sergeant Santiago Aravilla. Amid the chaos and bloodshed on Hill 187, one soldier's bravery stood out. Sergeant Santiago Aravilla, a radio telephone operator in Charlie Company. His courage under fire would not only save the lives of his fellow soldiers, but also earn him the Medal of Honor, though it would take 45 years for that recognition to come. As his platoon fought its way up the hill, Aravilla was ordered to stay back and administer first aid to wounded soldiers. But as he moved between the injured men, he realized that the enemy had 4 machine gun bunkers positioned to wipe out his entire unit. His comrades were trapped, pinned down by relentless fire, and had no way to escape. Aravilla had a choice: stay in cover or risk his life to save his fellow soldiers. He chose to fight. Arming himself with 2 M16 rifles, several hand grenades, and extra ammunition, Aravilla crawled through the dirt and jungle brush toward the first bunker. Under heavy fire, he threw a grenade inside, taking out the enemy soldiers inside. Without hesitation, he sprinted to the next bunker, using his 2 rifles to lay down suppressive fire. He repeated this process 4 times, eliminating every machine gun position on the hill. His fearless assault saved his platoon from being wiped out and allowed the 101st Airborne to continue their attack. Despite his heroism, Aravilla's actions went unrecognized for decades. It wasn't until 2014, 45 years later, that he was finally awarded the Medal of Honor for his bravery. His story is just one example of the incredible courage displayed by the soldiers of the 101st Airborne during the Battle of Tam Kỳ. But the fight for Hill 187 was far from over. The enemy wasn't done yet. 7. Continuing combat, Hill 187 and Hill 376, late May, early June 1969. Despite Sergeant Santiago Aravilla's incredible heroism, the battle for Hill 187 was far from over. The 101st Airborne Division had managed to gain ground, but the NVA wasn't backing down. The fight continued with relentless attacks, brutal ambushes, and heavy casualties. As the sun set on May 21, 1969, American forces finally managed to secure a part of Hill 187, but the price was high: 12 men killed and 49 wounded. Yet the enemy was still out there. The NVA troops had not completely retreated. Instead, they had pulled back to a massive bunker complex at the hill's summit, waiting for another chance to strike. The next day, U.S. commanders made a tough decision. Rather than losing more men in direct assaults, they called in airstrikes. 3 250-pound bombs were dropped directly onto the enemy bunkers. The powerful explosions sent shockwaves through the jungle, collapsing tunnels and forcing the remaining NVA troops to flee. Hill 187 was finally under American control, but the battle wasn't over. The NVA wasn't just defending one hill, they controlled the entire region. As the 101st Airborne pushed forward, they encountered more heavily defended enemy positions. The next major battle took place at Hill 376, where another NVA stronghold was waiting for them. On June 2, 1969, the 1st Battalion, 501st Infantry Regiment, moved toward Hill 376. Just as before, the NVA was waiting. This time, an 18-man platoon from the 2nd Squadron, 17th Cavalry Regiment got pinned down by a much larger enemy force. For 7 straight days, the Americans fought to take Hill 376. The battle was just as intense as Hill 187, with soldiers facing a constant barrage of machine gun fire, mortars, and grenades. Once again, the enemy used tunnels and spider holes to launch surprise attacks, appearing behind American positions before vanishing underground. The fighting reached its peak on June 9th. At dawn, Delta Company woke up to the sound of enemy mortar shells raining down on their position. Luckily, the bombardment was inaccurate, causing no casualties. But the attack was just the beginning. Reconnaissance reports indicated a large-scale enemy assault was coming. As expected, hundreds of NVA soldiers charged up the hill, firing everything they had at the Americans. Delta Company was in danger of being overrun. The air cavalry came just in time. American helicopters and fighter jets arrived, unleashing devastating firepower that broke the enemy's advance. With air support and heavy artillery, the soldiers of the 101st were able to hold the line. But just as the battle seemed to be ending, disaster struck, a friendly fire incident. An American airstrike mistakenly hit Bravo Company, causing more casualties. Despite this tragedy, the soldiers continued their mission, determined to defeat the NVA. By June 12, 1969, the exhausted men of the 101st Airborne were finally relieved from Hill 376. Another brutal battle had ended, but the war was far from over. 8. The final push and conclusion of Operation Lamar Plain. August 1969. After weeks of brutal combat at Hill 187 and Hill 376, the 101st Airborne Division was exhausted. The men had fought in intense heat, with little rest, low supplies, and constant enemy ambushes. But their mission wasn't over yet. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, had suffered heavy losses, but they were not completely defeated. Instead of fighting in large battles, they began splitting into smaller units, retreating into the dense jungles of Quảng Tín Province. They avoided direct engagements and instead relied on hit-and-run attacks, booby traps, and sniper fire. American commanders realized that continuing the same tactics wouldn't work. Instead of launching more assaults on enemy-held hills, they changed their strategy. The mission now focused on tracking down the scattered NVA forces and destroying their supply routes. For the next 2 months, the 101st Airborne carried out constant patrols and search missions. The jungle was filled with dangers, not just enemy snipers, but also hidden bunkers, traps, and underground tunnels. The enemy had built an entire network of hospitals, storage facilities, and living quarters beneath the jungle floor. One of the largest discoveries was made near Fire Support Base Boxer, where soldiers uncovered an extensive system of enemy bunkers and tunnels. Inside, they found weapons, medical supplies, and even makeshift classrooms where the NVA had trained new recruits. These findings proved just how well prepared the enemy was and why the battle had been so difficult. By August 11, 1969, the U.S. military decided it was time to end Operation Lamar Plain. The 101st Airborne had pushed the NVA out of Quảng Tín Province, and the remaining enemy forces had retreated into the mountains. One by one, American units boarded helicopters, trucks, and transport planes, heading back to their base at LZ Sally. Finally, on August 14, 1969, at 8 a.m., Operation Lamar Plain was officially declared over. In total, 126 American soldiers were killed and 444 were wounded, a higher death toll than the famous Battle of Hamburger Hill. Yet, despite their sacrifices, very few people knew about this battle. It had been overshadowed by other events, and many of the fallen soldiers' families were even told their loved ones had died at Hamburger Hill instead of Tam Kỳ. The battle may have been forgotten by history, but the soldiers of the 101st Airborne never forgot. 9. The aftermath and historical neglect. The Battle of Tam Kỳ was one of the deadliest and most grueling fights of the Vietnam War. 126 American soldiers were killed and 444 were wounded, more than the infamous Battle of Hamburger Hill. But while Hamburger Hill became a symbol of the war's brutality, Tam Kỳ was largely forgotten. Why? The answer lies in the timing and secrecy surrounding the battle. At the same time as Tam Kỳ, the media was focused on Hamburger Hill. The American public was outraged by the heavy losses over a hill with little strategic value. Anti-war protests grew stronger, and politicians faced intense pressure to justify why American soldiers were still dying in Vietnam. The U.S. military understood that revealing another brutal, costly battle, just 100 miles south of Hamburger Hill, would only add fuel to the fire, so the battle was kept out of the headlines. Many families of the fallen were even told their loved ones had died at Hamburger Hill rather than at Tam Kỳ. For decades, Operation Lamar Plain and the sacrifices of the 101st Airborne remained unknown to the public. Veterans who had survived the battle felt ignored and forgotten. Unlike other famous battles, there were no movies, books, or documentaries to tell their story. It wasn't until much later that historians began uncovering the truth about what happened at Tam Kỳ. Veterans started sharing their experiences, and records from the battle were finally examined. In 2014, one of the heroes of Tam Kỳ, Sergeant Santiago Arevia, finally received the Medal of Honor nearly 45 years after his bravery on the battlefield. But despite these efforts, the Battle of Tam Kỳ still remains unknown to most Americans. The soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division fought with unmatched courage and determination. They endured weeks of relentless combat, surviving against impossible odds. Their sacrifices deserve to be remembered, not just by historians, but by everyone who values the bravery of those who serve. Their story should never be forgotten. The Battle of Tam Kỳ was one of the most brutal and overlooked battles of the Vietnam War. The soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division fought through weeks of relentless jungle warfare, facing an enemy that was well prepared, deeply entrenched, and willing to fight to the death. They battled through Hill 187, Hill 376, and countless ambushes, suffering from extreme heat, exhaustion, and heavy casualties. The enemy used underground tunnels, surprise attacks, and brutal close-quarters combat, making every day a fight for survival. Yet despite everything, the 101st Airborne never gave up. They pushed forward, adapted their strategy, and ultimately drove the North Vietnamese Army out of Quảng Tín Province. But their sacrifice was never truly recognized. While the world remembers Hamburger Hill, Tam Kỳ remains forgotten, hidden in the shadows of history. The soldiers who fought and died there were denied the honor they deserved. Many of their families were misled, never knowing the true story of their loved one's final battle. Even decades later, the battle remains largely unknown. Few books or documentaries tell the story. Veterans who survived carried the memories of their fallen brothers, but the world moved on. It's time to change that. The men of the 101st Airborne Division displayed unmatched bravery, resilience, and sacrifice. Their fight was not for recognition, but for their comrades and their duty. Now it is our responsibility to honor their memory. The Battle of Tam Kỳ deserves to be remembered, not just as another fight in the Vietnam War, but as a testament to the courage and endurance of American soldiers. Their story should be told, their sacrifices honored, and their legacy preserved. If you found this story important, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with others. More people need to know about the forgotten heroes of the 101st Airborne Division. Thank you for watching.